Think about Bitcoin, the largest asset in the world. Imagine earning yield on your Bitcoin. Imagine using Bitcoin as collateral. Imagine putting it to work. The liquidity is on Bitcoin. If the users are on Bitcoin, why would you build on anything else? All of this innovation and experimentation, financialization that's been built on Ethereum, how can we bring that to Bitcoin scaling? And so that's how we invented.
How do you deal with the slow finality on Bitcoin? I did a transaction recently, and to be honest, I was kind of shocked how long it took for it to finalize.
It seems like eternity for anyone who's in DeFi, but to an ordinary user that's used to settlement by their bank in 3 days, it's really fast.
Why should I not just bridge my Bitcoin to Ethereum, get like wrapped BTC there or whatever, and then just use DeFi there?
One, I would say, is
Today's episode is sponsored by the Stellar Development Foundation and Flipside Crypto. They've partnered up to bring a series of Flipside quests to the Stellar network. Quests are a fun, gamified way to explore Stellar and to dive into its growing DeFi ecosystem. By completing quests, you can earn rewards and, of course, bragging rights with your on-chain activity score. Getting started is easy. Just grab a Stellar wallet like Freighter or Hana and click the link in the description to jump into your first quest. All right, Alisia, great to have you on the TEACHMEDEFI podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. We haven't talked about Bitcoin's, like the Bitcoin ecosystem as much on the show, but recently we started going a bit deeper on there. I think we had P-Stake on once,
Nice.
and they started.
Yes.
Oh, you know them?
Yes. It's a small world. We all know each other.
Yeah, it's true. I feel like there's one person in particular. Every time I go to a conference, the first person I know, the first person I meet is that person, which is always weird to me. How small crypto appears to be still. But we had Mikil on from P-Stake, but he's not with the project anymore, I think. So that was a long time ago. And then recently we had Hemi on, and I think there is some overlap with some of the stuff you guys are doing. So maybe that will help me to wrap my head around your project a bit. But before we get into it, I think you have like an interesting Bitcoin story and background as well. I read that on your socials. I think it says like BTC class of 2015. And I think you financed your education with your Bitcoin gains. So yeah, tell me about it a bit.
Yeah, sure. So my Bitcoin story is somewhat accidental. So my background is fairly corporate. Most of my professional experience is in management consulting and corporate development all across emerging markets. And that was a really interesting experience. I lived all over Asia, all over Africa, all over Latin America. And I actually discovered Bitcoin when I was living in Brazil in 2015. So I was getting paid in Brazilian reais, which had crashed 30% that year, I believe, against the US dollar. And I was trying to pay my student loans that were back in Canada in Canadian. And I was just trying to find a way to not keep losing money and a way to repay my loans. And actually, Brazil is a very protectionist country. It's really, really hard to move your money outside of Brazil. I think in most fiat banking systems globally are like that. It's very difficult to repatriate your funds. And so as a result of that, I started looking into alternative methods. And actually, interestingly, São Paulo, which is where I was living, was a hub of fintech innovation at the time, continues to be to this day. And so I spoke to a few of my friends who were founding the space, and they said, you should really look into Bitcoin. It's really new. It's this new concept of permissionless money. And you can figure out a way to off-ramp it in Canada. So that's how I got into Bitcoin for the first time, was trying to pay back my student loans. And that's when I fully fell down the rabbit hole. So I think I read the white paper about a month later. And I weirdly saw it solving so many pain points that I'd seen across all of these different geographies. So as someone who saw, the rise of M-Pesa in Kenya and lived all over Latin America and Asia, I just saw like how fragmented banking was and the lack of access and democratization of finance as a concept. And I saw Bitcoin as really solving a ton of these pain points in such a simple and elegant way, as you can see in the white paper. So I got fully orange pilled, as we say, back then. And then from then on, started to explore the space a little bit more. So actually got into Ethereum as well in 2016, participated in the fervor of the whole ICO era, because I just thought it was really interesting that people were just really building new technologies and playing around with tokens, I thought was quite compelling. Was a bit of a trader, and then actually, came to the United States about 7 years ago to do my MBA, which I partially financed with my Bitcoin gains. Probably the worst financial decision of my life, but obviously a very fulfilling personal one.
They say investing in yourself has the best return. So you probably outdid your Bitcoin return.
That's what I tell myself as I cry myself to sleep every night. And then, yeah, and then when I came here, that's when I realized, oh, I can actually make a career out of my hobby. Because up until then, Bitcoin and crypto and trading was just really a hobby. And so I started building more actively in the space. Met my co-founder about 2 years ago, and have been building Botanix ever since.
I feel like you have quite a unique viewpoint then compared to other guests I've had on. You immediately had the lens of kind of more on the developing countryside and issues around devaluation of currencies and cross-border payments. I feel like these are all kind of PayFi verticals in a way that currently are getting much steam as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I'm really passionate about because I think for folks who are based in the United States, in the Western world, it's really hard to grasp how broken money is in different countries. And Bitcoin and crypto has way more product market fit in these countries because it's actually solving a pain point in terms of the relative instability of their national political economies. And so I'm very passionate about really starting product market fit exploration within emerging markets because that's where your users actually are. That's what they need access to crypto and to Bitcoin as an actual better monetary unit.
Yeah. Do you still have like a grasp, like an overview of how Bitcoin adoption has developed in Brazil, for example, since then?
It's very widely adopted in Brazil. I think it's probably one of the higher adoption rates globally. The thing with Brazil, though, is people are mostly still accessing Bitcoin through centralized exchanges or fintech apps. So mostly through centralized avenues. So not the decentralized, permissionless cypherpunk ideology, but at the same time, it is something that is solving a specific pain point and is not necessarily just a vehicle for gambling and speculation. It is, something that people use to protect their savings, and something that a lot of people have exposure to. And honestly, serving as rails of, Brazil really interestingly has quite a bit of CBDC exploration, which is interesting. I don't know if I'm necessarily supportive of that as a concept, but it's interesting that they're starting to do a lot of this exploration between like CBDCs and bank-issued stablecoins are actually exploring blockchain and decentralized ledger technologies as rails for a new financial system, which is quite a forward-looking country from that perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think it sounds like we have similar views on CBDCs. Europe has been pushing a bit towards that as well. I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, nor am I. I think it's completely counterintuitive to why we're all here and why we're all building the space. Yes, but the thing with blockchain is it is permissionless, so people can do whatever they want with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like it kind of makes crypto even more necessary in a way for people who kind of might say, oh, what do we need it for? It's kind of like, okay, but you might get more authoritative systems like CBDCs, and then you need a counterweight to that to kind of keep your freedom in a way, right? So this is right now, that's the only counterweight you're seeing, or with meaningful adoption.
Exactly.
But yeah, so in terms of the project as well that you are building, Botanix, do I say it correctly?
Yes, exactly.
Right. So this is a bit focused towards programmability on Bitcoin, right? And DeFi on Bitcoin. What does that space look like today? And what kind of inspired you to build DeFi infrastructure on Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, a few years ago when I was looking to build something in the space, honestly, I wasn't really that inspired by what was going on. And I met my co-founder, and he and I kind of came to this insight that this is the largest, blue ocean opportunity in terms of building within crypto. Because if you think about it, Bitcoin is has proven itself to be the best money in the world, right? It has stood the test of time. It is the largest, the most liquid, the most original blockchain that there is. But there's very limited utility on Bitcoin. So Ethereum has programmability built in. It has the EVM, it has smart contracts, but Bitcoin does not. There's no smart contracts. There's very limited programmability available on the base layer. So why all of this innovation and experimentation and financialization that's been built on Ethereum, why can't that actually happen on Bitcoin? And that to me was a really, really interesting problem statement to work with, which is how do we make Bitcoin money again? Instead of just it's sitting there and languishing as digital gold, which also has, other implications for the long-term future and sustainability of the Bitcoin protocol. So we started with this initial thesis of, okay, let's bring utility and scaling to Bitcoin. Then we started thinking about, okay, what is the catalyst that's really going to enable this? And we got to the EVM. So if you look at early projects and experiments within Bitcoin scaling, a lot of folks have tried to reinvent the wheel and build their own virtual machines. We said, hey, why don't we take the stack that already exists, that already has scale, developers, tooling, ecosystem, audits, all of these things that you need in order to build successful protocols. Why don't we bring that to Bitcoin? And we were actually one of the first ones to do that. And we had to do a lot of education to Bitcoiners to say that, okay, EVM is not Ethereum. We have no connection to Ethereum. It's just a software and execution client. So we started with this initial thesis of bringing EVM to Bitcoin. And then we built our scaling approach, which we call the spider chain. So the thesis here really was there's lots of ways potentially you can scale Bitcoin, right? You can build, a federated sidechain. You can build a rollup. You can build an Ethereum L2, right? Which is what a lot of folks are doing. What we wanted to do is build something that was on Bitcoin, so that inherits Bitcoin security, Bitcoin finality, Bitcoin as the gas token and settlement layer, right? From a UX perspective, also just made sense to have it all be built on Bitcoin, and that optimize for decentralization. So if you think about what has made Bitcoin great over the past, 15 or so years, it comes down to two things. It comes down to the decentralization of the Bitcoin protocol and the programming scarcity that is embedded within it. So, and again, after speaking to hundreds of Bitcoiners at this point, this is the one thing that they're all consensus upon is their value for the decentralization of the protocol. To this day, it's still the only truly decentralized one. So we basically thought, how can we bring that decentralization ethos to Bitcoin scaling? And so that's how we invented the spider chain. My co-founder is a cryptographer, and his approach really was a zoomed out version of the Lightning Network. So Lightning has, 1 out of 1 channel factories. This is basically a zoomed out version of this. So the way that it works, it's a randomized rotating set of multisigs that's secured by a proof of stake consensus mechanism that is used to secure the Bitcoin on the second layer. So proof of stake that's built on top of proof of work, inheriting Bitcoin security, Bitcoin finality, and on Bitcoin. This also means that there's no consensus changes needed to Bitcoin, no soft forks needed. It can run today as it is. And it's also extremely performant because we don't have any sort of data availability issues. So this to us was the optimal mix and the right trade-offs between performance and decentralization. And that's how we came up with the spider chain, started building. We've been in testnet for over a year now, and we're headed to mainnet soon.
Oh, wow. Okay. Maybe I just ask quite pragmatically about what that looks like in use. So, for example, do you have to bridge Bitcoin over to your chain, and then you can use smart contracts, or what does that look like?
Exactly. So basically, you bridge your Bitcoin from Bitcoin L1 to Botanix L2. That's our native bridge. That's the main product that we're building. And it's a peg in and peg out mechanism. So you basically peg into our chain. On our chain, you transact in Bitcoin and with Bitcoin. And it's all at around a 5-second block time, 2-cent transaction fees, and all EVM. So to the point where you use your MetaMask or your Rabi, whatever hot wallet have you, to actually interact with whichever protocol you would like to. And it all settles back to Botanix. And whenever you want to, you can also peg out of Botanix back to Bitcoin base layer.
Oh, okay. And in terms of the security of the protocol, you mentioned proof of stake, but there's different concepts around enshrined rollups versus how layer 2s on Ethereum usually work. What is there like a connection to the Bitcoin chain where you have dispute settlement there, or maybe that's not really possible, but where you post perhaps state hashes on Bitcoin? What is there any connection to the Bitcoin chain?
Exactly. So we basically anchor the data to the Bitcoin chain. So at a certain interval, we basically post the anchor state to Bitcoin base layer. So that's how it works. It's more like checkpointing.
Gotcha. This brings me back a bit like with Hemi, because how they did it was like they put the state hashes, I guess, on Bitcoin, and then they use Ethereum for data availability. So the whole transactions and stuff are there then, and you could like rebuild the blocks should you need to based on that. How do you go about data availability, I guess, is the question.
So because we're not a rollup, we don't have the data availability issue. So we don't need to post the data anywhere. So that's how we're very different. We're not a rollup. So what most folks who are claiming to be building Bitcoin L2s do is they will basically, because it's not possible to build rollups on Bitcoin because Bitcoin is not Turing complete. There are folks who are attempting to do so now with BitVM, which is a new construct within the space. However, there's a lot of complexity there. It also has some trade-offs in terms of performance, right? So what most folks who are, claiming to do rollups on Bitcoin are doing is they'll basically bring Bitcoin in some form of custodial fashion to Ethereum and then build a rollup on Ethereum, because that you can actually do. So I think that's the approach that most folks are taking.
Right. And I read something about you guys having already a decentralized validator set. So I think it's at like 16 validators. And it sounded like this is quite unique in the space right now.
So our thesis is when it comes to decentralization, it shouldn't just be at the architectural level. So at the architecture level, we have the spider chain, which is like this unique decentralized network of multi-sigs approach that we have. So that's how we're decentralized at the architecture level. But that decentralization also needs to sing at the infrastructure level, right? So we're starting out with what we call the founding federation, which are 16, node validators. We actually call them orchestrators that are used to secure the chain. And we're only running one of the 16. So we're actually fully decentralized from the start. We have no control over the validators or the founding federation. So the governance is already fully distributed from day one, which you've never really seen in any sort of Bitcoin blockchain before. But that's only the first step. So after about a year or so, we're going to move to about 100 nodes, which is a stage we call the DynaFed, which is going to enable more permissionless entry or exit. And about 2 years from now, we're going to exceed over 1,000 nodes, which is what we consider like almost fully permissionless. So our goal is honestly to be more decentralized than Ethereum itself, as we expand the validator set, as we expand the infrastructure and the number of signers. And the more nodes we have, the more decentralized the network becomes and the more randomized the multi-sigs as well are within the spider chain. So that's how it works behind the hood. And yeah, it's quite novel. No one else is doing anything like this. And yeah, that's what massively differentiates us is one, starting off decentralized day one and then continuing to become more permissionless over time, both in terms of our architecture, but also our infrastructure.
Right. Well, how do you describe yourself? Is this like a layer 2 or layer 1? Or?
We consider ourselves the most decentralized Bitcoin blockchain. So layer 2 is probably the closest crypto-like terminology that we can fit ourselves into. There's a lot of semantics about the true definition of an L2, but I think in terms of building a specific second layer in order to enable scaling and programmability, I think that's pretty much what we are. So Bitcoin L2, that's EVM.
Right. So this is very much different, I suppose, from like the one centralized sequencer that a lot of the Ethereum L2s have, right?
Exactly. So if you look at rollups within Ethereum, right, all of them have a centralized sequencer, which to us poses centralization risk as well as censorship resistance risk. If you think again about the properties of Bitcoin, which make it great, it boils down to trustlessness, decentralization, and censorship resistance. And the moment you have any form of a centralized sequencer that imposes some level of centralization or censorship risk, you see folks in Ethereum land like Arbitrum, they're now trying to move towards a decentralized sequencer, but I think in somewhat the preliminary stages, if I'm not mistaken. So we actually will start with a decentralized sequencer from day one. And so that's quite a massive differentiator.
Amazing. And what's like the difference? Like, for example, there's other layer twos on Bitcoin, right? Like Stacks, I believe. I feel like Stacks has been around for a few years. I haven't followed these things closely, to be honest. But or you mentioned the Lightning Network, and you drew some parallels to it. Just wondering, like, what differentiates you guys from those solutions? I suppose.
I mean, there's so many differences. I would say Stacks, I would compare more to an L1, right? Because they run on Stacks token. They don't necessarily run on Bitcoin, right? So they're their own ecosystem. Obviously, they largely rely upon Bitcoin, right? But I wouldn't necessarily mm, call them a Bitcoin L2 just because they run on Stacks. Lightning, I think, is the true Bitcoin L2 because it enables a unilateral withdrawal, and it's a fully permissionless network. And in fact, we work very closely with the Lightning Labs team, and very, very bullish on Lightning playing that interoperability role within a growing Bitcoin ecosystem. So in fact, we'll have like several Lightning bridges live on day one for people to be able to, bridge from Lightning to Botanix and vice versa. And we think that's going to be really, really interesting, for people to potentialize the Bitcoin they have in their Lightning wallets and put it to work within the Botanix ecosystem.
Okay, interesting. So, and now, I mean, you're bringing DeFi kind of to Bitcoin, but now the whole thing, like the problem you need to solve is still to kind of bootstrap an ecosystem around this, right? I feel like a lot of like a lot of layer ones in the space, like smart contract layer ones, I feel like struggled to get meaningful liquidity on their chain and adoption. So I've read about a few things here with you guys, which is I think Palladium, like a stable coin, Bitsy, which is a DEX, and Spindle, which is a lending and borrowing solution. So I'm just wondering how you're thinking now about bootstrapping this ecosystem around this. And I assume there's the idea as well to leverage the high liquidity and adoption of Bitcoin there. So yeah, just tell me a bit about it.
Yeah. So so I'm responsible for obviously building the ecosystem. So this is what I live and breathe all day long. It's really fascinating because we made some very tough business decisions early on, which made it very tough for us to bootstrap an ecosystem. So very early on, we said, we're not going to do grants. We're not going to do incentives. We're not going to do an incubator. We're not going to do an accelerator. We're not going to do points. We made a lot of these really tough decisions, which makes it very, very hard to bootstrap an ecosystem in an industry that is really driven by incentives. We did that for several reasons. One, because we think the moment you introduce any of these elements, there's an element of cheating product market fit and really not finding your footing as an actual product or as an ecosystem. Two, we've seen that these incentives don't necessarily work in the long term and attracts, a certain profile of like a mercenary capital, which doesn't really contribute to long-term sustainability. And three, and most importantly, it's not Bitcoin. Like a Bitcoin is just it's a different world. It's a cult almost, right? And Bitcoiners are very averse to all of this. We as a team, we're Bitcoiners, we're very averse to all of this. We just think that it's not very Bitcoin aligned to be doing this. We need to keep things as credibly neutral as possible. And I know that receives a lot of flack within the Ethereum community for being an illusory concept, but we think in Bitcoin it's actually impossible to win without it, without this element of neutrality. So actually, honestly, in the beginning, when I was bootstrapping this ecosystem, I was just going up to people and telling them about Botanix. I was like, hey guys, think about Bitcoin, largest asset in the world. Imagine putting it to work. Imagine earning yield on your Bitcoin. Imagine using Bitcoin as collateral. Imagine being stables with your Bitcoin. So just painting the market opportunity was attractive enough to bring a lot of builders over, because for them, it's like, hey, this is actual new liquidity. This is actual new users. There's this paradigm within crypto that, we're all trying to scrape together 3 users together, right? Like, who are these users in crypto?
Yeah.
And honestly, I've experienced this myself, and it's not the case within Bitcoin. Bitcoin actually has users. Bitcoin to date is the most retail-friendly cryptocurrency in the entire world. There's more individual Bitcoin holders than anything by pretty severe factor. And so if you're looking for users, Bitcoin has them. If you're looking for liquidity, Bitcoin has it. And what's really interesting is these are new users and new liquidity that's never been on chain before. So if you're able to provide them with a good experience, an easy UX and simple opportunities and financial primitives, you're going to be able to attract a massive swath of users. So I think the first thing to think about is let's look at the market opportunity, which is obviously huge. The second thing is product. And I know product-led growth is considered like quite a fluffy term within tech, but I strongly believe in it. I think the main reason Botanix has succeeded is because we are by far the best Bitcoin L2 in the entire world from a product perspective. And we have achieved a lot of technical respect and credibility with respect to our product. It works really well. It's very user-friendly to build on. So I think that's like the second piece and by far the largest piece that's enabled us to attract a lot of these filters over without any sort of incentives. It's a really, really good product. So if you want to do anything in Bitcoin, you should be doing it on Botanix. And that I think is, I'm obviously biased to your own research, but I think that is generally the consensus within Bitcoin. And I think the third thing, and I say this as an ecosystem builder, is just to be nice and just to be supportive. So as an ecosystem that doesn't do any sort of incentive program, I've had to rely upon, hey, how can I roll up my sleeves and help you as much as humanly possible to succeed, right? Because at the end of the day, we have the access to Bitcoin users. We can talk to a lot of, we can bring our communities to a lot of these different applications. And so being able to do that, being able to leverage our network and our expertise has been huge for helping a lot of these teams succeed. And so, yeah, I think that's what's enabled us to build a very strong ecosystem of net new builder teams, and really proud. We have a ton of teams that are building only on Botanix and no other chains, which is quite a feat. A bunch of them have also received venture funding, which is so cool. It's like seeing things come to life. And, especially when your ecosystem teams get funded, you're like, wow, people are actually seeing the vision and backing this vision. And then in addition to that, in addition to the net new builder teams, we also have, tier one Ethereum DeFi teams that are coming over to Bitcoin for the first time. So GMX, which is one of the largest perpetual dexes in the world, is deploying on Botanix. And I think we're the only chain they're expanding to natively this year. Similarly for Dolomite, we're the only Bitcoin chain that they're expanding to as their lending protocol. And for us, that was also important to get some of these larger protocols over, because at the end of the day, that is like battle-tested code. And they've already achieved scale when it comes to managing large amounts of liquidity and users. So for Bitcoiners who love and trust, brands and battle-tested code, they actually also like having the comfort of, okay, yeah, I can open a long on Bitcoin on GMX, or okay, I can, borrow USDC against my Bitcoin on Dolomite. So having that, the reputation of these protocols also really helps us in terms of being able to bring the Bitcoiners over on chain. And I'm very open and honest about this, which is our number one focus is bringing new users on chain, and not necessarily recycling the same users that exist in EVM land. And so I was thinking through, what is that value proposition going to look like for a normie or a Bitcoiner who's never been on chain before and doesn't understand how looping works, for example, right? You need to really simplify what their DeFi experience is looking like, to the point where we don't even call it DeFi, we call it Bitcoin finance, because to them, DeFi already is to Ethereum of a term, right? So it's thinking through the entire user experience with an average crypto user in mind, who's not necessarily on CT, who doesn't necessarily want to earn 400% yield. They want to earn 4% yield from sources that they understand. So it's like a different psychology of user that we're trying to bring in. I'm really excited to have some of the best teams in the world building on us, to really realize this, because at the end of the day, we are a blockchain. We're just a platform. So the onus is upon the applications building on Botanix to really realize this vision and bring it to life.
This is really really fascinating that within the crypto industry that is not that large yet, how there seems to be like such a different audience that you described, like what Bitcoiners kind of look for or want, and how it's different from perhaps someone on ETH or Solana or something like that. Because I was gonna ask, I understood some of the points, but I was going to ask, so a bit provocatively, I guess, what's the difference here in terms of why should I not just bridge my Bitcoin to Ethereum, get like wrapped BTC there or whatever, and then just use DeFi there? What's the different value prop here?
One, I would say, is you're assuming a lot of bridging risk every time you're bridging over to another blockchain, right? Is you're assuming a lot of bridging risk there. Two, I would say you probably have to use some sort of a Bitcoin derivative, which is largely always controlled by a centralized entity. So there's that, I think, dilutes the quality potentially of that specific Bitcoin derivative.
Yeah. So maybe to follow up on that point. So how is the bridging different here, just to drive that home, I guess? The bridging to your chain different than that one?
Yeah, I think it's the word bridge is a bit of a misnomer. You're pegging and pegging out of a Bitcoin chain. So it's a little bit different because it is all tied to Bitcoin at the end of the day. Whereas it's not like when you bridge to Ethereum, it's a cross-chain bridge. And it's usually done in some sort of a custodial fashion. And so that's, I think, the key difference is the bridging to a completely different chain, usually using some form of a wrapped asset, which poses some sort of centralization risk, and you're assuming some risk there. And honestly, the UX is very, very difficult. I think for an everyday person, who wants to use their Bitcoin, I think the UX is challenging to grapple with, which is why most Bitcoiners or most normies even who want to put their Bitcoin to work, they do it through like Coinbase or through a centralized entity. They're not going to do it through decentralized means because it is so much more convoluted to do so. However, and this is very important because I know a lot of people debate the value of decentralization. Decentralization is not important to the end user until it is.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
one of those weird things, people don't care really. They want the easiest user experience until they get hacked. Like I've been drained of bridges. That's why I'm so like cautious of bridges, right? And because that is probably the most hacked protocol, right, within crypto.
Yeah. Can I ask you what the situation was, for example, in your case? Was it something like, if you receive a wrapped asset, you depend on the backing of it. So the real asset that's locked probably in a centralized pool, which is kind of like a honeypot that hacker can attack and drain. Was it something like
Exactly.
this?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So it's and one of those things where and to give you some more context, a lot of Bitcoiners were using BlockFi and Celsius, right? So we're totally okay with using those. Again,
Both went bankrupt, right?
exactly. Both went bankrupt, both deeply centralized. There's so many layers of embedded risk there. So it's one of those things where you don't care about decentralization until you do, until you get hacked, which is why that's why the federation that we're starting with, this decentralized validator set, is so important because no single entity has control of your funds. And that's the way to think of it if you're a user. It's like, okay, no single entity will ever have control of the funds within Botanix, right? And so it's important from a user experience perspective. It's important from a security and risk management perspective. But I would say those are the two major ways we differentiate from Ethereum DeFi. And I think in general, Ethereum DeFi is its own world. And I say this as a former DeFi degen, right? Like it's truly like speaking a different language. And if you try to onboard a normal person into a looping mechanism, it takes at least 20 sentences of explanation and about 8 steps of onboarding, right? And so being able to simplify this as much as possible and explain the layers of risk involved are really important. And I think especially for a person who's never been on chain before, be it a Bitcoiner or be it a normal person who has access to Bitcoin through an ETF, what they really want to know is, okay, I understand that Bitcoin is money. I understand money is eventually financialized and you need to build primitives that are based off of it, right? I still need to understand where that yield comes from. And I think a lot of people cannot answer that. right? Our yield model is very simple. 50% of all of the gas fees from network activity goes back to the stakers because we're proof of stake. That's where the yield comes from. And so just being able to explain your financial primitives in simple, comprehensible terms is huge. So I think it comes down to minimize trust assumptions in terms of the bridging point of things. It comes from not using any sort of centralized synthetic Bitcoin derivatives. It comes from the user experience. It comes from the decentralization. So I would say those are like the main ways we differentiate as a Bitcoin L2 versus, hey, just use WBTC on Ethereum.
Mm. Yeah, okay, I getcha. So basically, stakers will also not receive any inflation from a token. All they get is basically from the gas fees, the 50%, right?
Exactly. So our job as a blockchain is to build an attractive environment for builders to come, build cool stuff so that people use it, so that they transact on it, and then all of those transaction fees that is denominated in Bitcoin goes back to the stakers. So
Okay.
that yield is not affiliated with the token, not affiliated with points. It's all Bitcoin in, Bitcoin out.
Well, that's quite the principled approach. And how do you deal? Because you mentioned UX, user experience, and I totally relate to that. I mean, still, it can be a nightmare to use some of these on-chain things. Just doing things on-chain. But like, how do you think about Bitcoin in that context? And like, for example, how do you deal with the slow finality on Bitcoin? Like, I don't use Bitcoin much, but I did a transaction recently, and to be honest, I was kind of shocked how long it took for for it to finalize.
Yeah, it's funny because it's 10 minutes, right? And it seems like eternity for anyone who's in DeFi, but to an ordinary user that's used to settlement by their bank in 3 days, it's really fast. And when you hit Botanix, where you're at 5 seconds, it's lightning fast. So it's just a different ball game. I think of Bitcoin scaling in 2025, I compare it to like Ethereum in 2021, you know? It feels like the early days. Um, and so like all of these efforts in Bitcoin scaling, we're still at like the very early stages, and it's still a huge improvement over anything that they've ever experienced before. So it's a metric improvement. And like the provocation I always have is once we're able to achieve all of this on Bitcoin, why would you even need anything else? Right? Bitcoin has already proved itself as the best money ever. It's the one thing that you can talk to the biggest ETH max in the world, it will still hold some Bitcoin, right? And so it's one of those things where if you're finally able to build on Bitcoin, the liquidity is on Bitcoin, if the users are on Bitcoin, like why would you build on anything else? You know, from a finance perspective, I think that there's some interesting like gaming, social, identity use cases that are possible with higher throughput blockchains. But if you think about why Bitcoin started as money, right, and the value of it being this peer-to-peer electronic cash, it's because at the end of the day, the thing that needs to be most decentralized is finance, right? So actually, I was like, there's a blog post that Vitalik posted in October of last year where he basically referenced this specifically, which is that DeFi needs to live on Ethereum because Ethereum still is today, like in Ethereum land at least, the most decentralized. And DeFi or decentralized finance needs the decentralization that's inherent to Ethereum L1. And I would make a similar analogy for Bitcoin, right? So if you think about money and the movement of money being something that benefits from decentralization and censorship resistance, it should be on Bitcoin. It already is the biggest and largest liquid like crypto asset in the world. And so that's my provocation. I think we almost need to shift our mentality in terms of thinking, why aren't you building on Bitcoin? The issue is like obviously very few Bitcoin projects have taken off, right? And it's because they weren't really solving for the Bitcoiner or the average user in mind. They were just trying to, I guess, build a similar approach as they've seen within Ethereum. But building in Bitcoin requires something fundamentally different, which is why, for example, we are taking such difficult business decisions in terms of bootstrapping the ecosystem because it is a fundamentally different beast.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Kind of like crypto people always tend to denominate their wealth, their portfolio in Bitcoin.
Yeah,
And you tend to want to stack sats. Is that
tax
right?
that.
Stack sats.
Humble tax
So
that. Yeah.
yeah, there you go. So there is this kind of there's this natural gravitation towards it, I guess, which definitely should help.
Yeah, it's interesting because like it's not just crypto users. Like I was at Bitcoin Vegas 2 weeks ago. We had our massive activation there. I spoke at the conference, and it wasn't like full of companies who are looking to build their Bitcoin treasury. And so it's not just everyday users anymore that are crypto native. It's mom and pop like pet stores who are like, okay, yeah, maybe I should put Bitcoin on my balance sheet. So it's just people's mindset towards Bitcoin is just fundamentally shifting. And I think they're only doing that with Bitcoin. They're not doing that with any other crypto because it has legitimized itself beyond beyond what we were honestly expecting, right? And so that adoption, that legitimization also comes with this wave of new users and this wave of adoption. And I think it's on us to serve them, but also not teach them, but show them the ways of Bitcoin almost, like not your keys, not your crypto, the importance of self-custody. I think it's really important, and I know you're all about Teach Me DeFi, right? It's really important that for someone who's coming into Bitcoin for the first time and maybe they access it through their ETF account, right? And their 401k, that's all well and good. I think that's a great way to enter in the ecosystem and start learning about Bitcoin. But I think it would be really, really powerful if then they learned how the Bitcoin protocol works, how proof of work works, how to, build, like set up a hardware wallet and really secure their Bitcoin. Um, and so I think that's another piece of this whole interconnected Bitcoin puzzle that we're building that we as Bitcoiners need to solve for.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. There's also this perspective for sure. I mean, the people who come into crypto tends to come through Bitcoin as well. So to provide them like a good user experience and additional functionality that goes beyond just holding Bitcoin and sending it and receiving it, I think is definitely a worthwhile mission. Super interesting. So, what's kind of like next? What you're excited about? Like, let's say for the next 2 years for you guys.
I love that question. I think we're launching fairly soon, so very excited about that. And we're launching with 20 applications right off the bat, which are, some of the teams that have been building us with us for some time, as well as some of those cross deployments I referred to earlier. And activating our community of users that we've been building for about 2 years, and especially really excited about those net new Bitcoin users that are part of our community that are really excited to do more with their Bitcoin. So in all of the conversations I've had with Bitcoiners, it comes down to two questions, right? It's what can I do with my Bitcoin and how are you going to keep it safe, right? So I think our goal as a blockchain over the next 2 years is just to expand within those two, right? So in terms of keeping it safe, we spend some time on our security model, on our architecture, on our infrastructure. The goal is to keep distributing the network and adding more nodes and making it more permissionless to distribute that trust as much as we possibly can. And then the second piece is doing more cool stuff with your Bitcoin. So actually really interesting. Right now we have, a few decentralized exchanges that are coming on board. So you mentioned them right off the bat, like Bitsy and Arch. We have stable coins with CDPs rather like Palladium. We have liquid staking like Rover. We have Dolomite as our flagship lending protocol. We have GMX coming over. Those are all going to come together and build out those simple financial primitives for Bitcoiners to start off with. But I'm also super excited for like the next frontier. So we're exploring things within digital identity, which I think is very, very interesting if we can do so in a privacy preserving way, because that's also another very core property of Bitcoin. We're doing some really cool stuff within real world asset tokenization because I have a lot to say about tokenization. I think it's largely not it. Like I think it's It's a narrative more than anything else, to be honest. And we can get into my theories for why that is. But what's really interesting about real world asset tokenization is for those assets that actually require tokenization, which is actually very few, to be honest. For those assets that actually require tokenization, either in terms of thinking about it from a fractionalization as a potential like benefit, or the democratization of that asset class, or creating secondaries market, all of that, right? What we've heard from a lot of these institutional investors is they want to do it on Bitcoin. Like if they could choose any blockchain to tokenize on, why would it not be Bitcoin? So that's their almost immediate, their immediate thought, And as someone who used to actually sell tokenization a few years ago, there's also like this broad.
That sounds funny. It sounds like we're going door to door selling tokenization.
Basically, door to door on Wall Street selling tokenization. It's really interesting because a few years ago, a lot of these banks were like, "Oh yeah, we'll just build our own blockchain, no problem." And it's like, actually, it's really hard to do so.
Yeah, that was a phase. Yeah,
that was the phase, and now they're finally realizing that permissionless blockchains are way better. And a lot of that activity is obviously concentrated within Ethereum, right? So Ethereum L1 is still the desired deployment avenue for most of these tokenized assets because, again, that's where the liquidity is, that's where the users are. However, again, if you think about intuitively what makes the most sense for a lot of these institutions that already have Bitcoin exposure through their ETFs, through their treasury, through a lot of the things that they're working on, and through their customers demanding it, they want to do it on Bitcoin. And so that's also a really interesting other avenue that we're exploring, just purely from an inbound perspective. But then there's so much other stuff. As I mentioned, my entire background is in emerging markets. I'm extremely passionate about Bitcoin having way more product market fit in these countries than in any other, than in the United States where I live, or Canada where I'm from, or Germany where you're based, right? So it's really expanding adoption, education, and financial primitives that are based on Bitcoin for all of these markets in a way that guarantees self-sovereignty, that preserves privacy for these end users. So I'm actually planning to spend, most of the next 2 years exploring a lot of these use cases in these emerging markets. I'm probably working with a lot of these like centralized actors because at the end of the day, they're the ones that own the relationship with the user. And they're the ones who are bringing these folks on chain, but doing so in a way that is decentralized, I think is imperative above all. And that's what we will be championing.
Amazing. Yeah, this is exciting stuff, I think, and it comes at a good time as well. So yeah, all the best with this. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Alisia. This has been wonderful. Anything else you want to share? We'll put all the links in the show notes as well for people.
I would say let's actually finally do more with our Bitcoin, and let's actually make it active. It's interesting because I was playing around with our product, and it's so interesting. I keep my limited Bitcoin because obviously officially, hint, wink, nudge, I don't own any Bitcoin. But if I were to own Bitcoin, it would probably be on ledgers and Casa wallets, right? And it's really interesting. There is a psychological weight of like moving Bitcoin from your cold wallets to a hot wallet, And it's funny because I actually went through that myself, and I was like, oh, this is wild. But then if you're able to do so, as I mentioned, in a way that is user friendly and that shows the clear benefit of doing so, that's and I did it because I think it's going to be really exciting. We're going to be able to enable real Bitcoin yield. And I was like, okay. And I'm putting in all, like our whole team, we're putting in almost all of our Bitcoin on day one, just because that's how much we believe in the network. And I urge everyone else to try it out and give us some feedback, because we always want to be better.
Thank you so much, Alisia.
Thank you so much.